Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast, the podcast where we take matters of local, national, and international political importance and discuss them in a fair, reasonable, and even-handed way. I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sainsbury. Are you fair and I'm reasonable? Or?
I think I'm probably the most reasonable of the two of us. I think it's yourself that's a bit of a firebrand when it comes to matters political. So,
okay, answers in the comments, please. Please,
exactly. And it's our last podcast before we get greener. As the clocks go, whatever they go do tomorrow, spring forward, and we can broadcast without there having to be lights on in the background.
Okay, yeah, that will save us the 12p or something from the LEDs that we've got running. Well done for going green, mate. I'd
absolutely. It's the way forward, and so we get that this week. It's just the two of us. Mm-hmm. There's a song in that somewhere, and we're going to unpick. Rachel from Accounts stood up on Wednesday and gave us, I think, what she described as her spring statement, and I think what that lovable scamp Mel Stride described as an emergency budget. Yeah, I guess we'll unpick what it was and what it wasn't, and what we liked and didn't like about it.
Yeah, indeed. So should we get straight into some headline information from the Chancellor's statement?
Yeah. What was the big news?
We can go to we'll dive straight in, but we're trying not to kill by PowerPoint. So one of the key things was GDP growth. The OBR have forecast that down from, in October they were forecasting that to be 2%, and now they're forecasting that down to be 1%. And we'll go into some of these in a bit of detail later. The current budget target headroom, which was it's basically the reserve for if anything kind of unexpected happens, which seems to be pretty much a weekly occurrence these days, considering what happens across the Atlantic. And that in October 2024 was 9.9 billion. And now it's also 9.9 billion. But in the meantime, that was actually kind of lost and has now been regained.
And I guess that's at the heart of why there were changes, isn't it? To be fair, I think those 2 points probably, like you say, we'll go into more detail. But with the growth target falling, that 9.9 billion surplus fell to being a 4.1 billion deficit. So pencils were sharpened, calculators were got out based on the new growth forecast, and levers were pulled, to use the management vernacular. Anyone playing management bingo can run that up the flagpole and salute it. Levers were pulled to get the 9.9 billion headroom back by the end of the term.
Yes, and by levers we mean LEVER, not
yes.
LEA,
oh yes.
LEAV,
No. We still
not that kind of lever.
No, definitely not.
Yes. There's some stuff about GDP growth. So having revised it down for this year. The OBR is then saying that essentially, kind of on average, I think it's about 1.3% growth over the next 5 years, and there's some stuff about spending increases. So interestingly, the Chancellor talked about bringing forward some of the investment that she's making. So actually, there's some increases in overall spending over the next 4 years. But those are then actually turning into decreases in spending actually through 28, 29 and 29, 30, which I guess if you're trying to invest in improving things, then you want to load that money up front and see in order to be able to deliver that. How that ties into all of this devolution and local government reform thing, that would be an onion to peel.
There must be a line item somewhere.
There. There's some stuff about welfare changes, but I think we can get into that in a bit of detail as a separate one. But I think the headline there was a 4.8 billion pound projected saving that the OBR are forecasting, with over because there's going to be changes to the health element of universal credit for new claimants. It's going to be, it was already due to be reducing from £97 to £50, but that's then going to be frozen. And under 22-year-olds will no longer be eligible for the health element. So the OBR did some numbers on that would affect over 3 million families losing about £1,700 an annum, and an extra 250,000 people falling into relative poverty by 29-30, with an extra 50,000 of those being children. So we can probably spin that one out in a bit if you like.
Yeah, I think that's one we need to come back to, because I think that's caused them perhaps the most vexation between the Labour ranks and those who would describe themselves on the progressive left. So definitely more to dig into there.
Yeah, there's some stuff about changes in debt interest, but to be honest with you, I think the key thing there is to talk about actually just how much of national income is actually spent on just paying the interest on the debt that we've accrued. So there's that, and there's some stuff about inflation, which although it and this is something Mel Stride, the shadow chancellor,
didn't he just
chancellor made big light of, that basically on the day of the election last year, it was at target of 2%, and then since it's kind of crept back up again and is now easing back down. But there's some detail on how that will kind of come back into line with that. But essentially, those are kind of the headline items. Any one in particular you want to kind of go through in a bit more and discuss in a bit more detail?
Well, I think if we look at the the growth forecast and this kind of this, is it an obsession or is it Rachel Reeves made an awful lot of points around the fiscal rules which could not be broken. And I guess when you look at that, which was that by the end of the Parliament in 2030, she is absolutely adamant that she is not going to be producing a budget that will kind of end up with more going out than is coming in. I think that's a fair synopsis of her first fiscal rule, Simon. Would you say it's fair?
Yeah, so there are two fundamental fiscal rules. The first one is the one about that day-to-day spending is coming purely from taxation within by 2930, and the what was the other one? Can't remember it now. And there was another one which was about.
Yeah, so I guess if we just look at that first one, then for me, it was in October when there was a very clear state. The position was that there would be a 9.9 billion surplus. That has flicked quickly to being a 4.1 billion deficit. The Chancellor's taken some moves, in the spring statement to put that back. But I think there's a couple of interesting points that the OBR kind of threw alongside that. One is that I think it's a surplus of about 0.3%, which they have put a remark in that says that is lower than previous chancellors would look to run at. And their probability of hitting it was 54%. And I think back in October, they said the probability was 51%.
Yes, that's
so
right.
I am kind of 51 and 54 feels a little bit kind of flip a coin in the air. And you could argue that between October and March, the OBR has already got it wrong, because Plan A, which was in October, has, to all intents and purposes, failed. You lost your headroom and then 4 billion on top of that. So you're having another go in March, just 6 months later. And, whilst we can argue about 51, 54, and we'd never labor on this podcast on a 52-48 margin, but it does feel like it's still the flip of a coin as to whether this plan's actually going to work.
Well, I mean, see, the trouble is, and this kind of speaks to a bit of having two statements, essentially in two financial events, as they're calling them, in the course of a fiscal year, is that you don't necessarily actually have time for things to happen,
Yep.
or for any changes to actually bed in. So in some respects, you're kind of you're a hostage to your own fortune, or you're continually having to plate spin and firefight, because you set an expectation that you're going to be constantly reacting, and if you're reacting all the time, you're not in control. You're not following a strategy, are you? You are panically deciding which buttons to press by how much at which point. The other one, by the way, was the rule about that public debt to be projected to be falling as a share of the economy. But it's interesting that that's
Yes.
projected, not actually has.
No, and it's interesting that, again, and we'll probably come on to this when we come on to the welfare section, because there was an awful lot of, you know, and it's something that pops up on political forums about this is new austerity, which was a very conservative thing and was an ideological choice.
Mm.
And the kind of the two goals which you've outlined, what was almost identical to the conservative goals. That was we want, the Conservative Party wanted to get to the point where the public spending had shrunk such that it was, we were taking in more than we were spending out, and that national debt was starting to shrink. And very interesting, in 2019, just prior to the pandemic, the first one had been achieved. There was a budget surplus, and the second one was, the projection was, I think it was that sort of 2020, or the debt was going to start falling, and of course, to quote the great Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. COVID, coupled with a absolutely feckless prime minister fiscally, and his little puppet, the Boris and Rishi show, between
What?
those three of COVID, Boris and Rishi,
Yeah.
all of that kind of went completely out of the window. And
We're skipping
some of it
past Liz Truss.
understandably. Well, to be fair,
Did
we
she
were
not have an
already in a.
impact?
Oh, she did, but by that stage, the whole fiscally prudent kind of debt management, you know, was all of that was gone. And if you look at it, the Trussian response to that was to fecklessly, to use a poker analogy, just push all of her chips in with not really any cards to play in her hand, and scream, "I'm all in," and lost. So, but again, without wishing to run the whole of the history, I guess the parallel I'm drawing is that the fiscal rules that Rachel seems to be shooting for are pretty much identical to the same fiscal rules that the lovely George Osborne set in motion at the start of his term, followed up by Spreadsheet Phil.
You're not going to use the C word, are you?
No, 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 no,
The,
never, never.
no,
Oh,
not
no.
that one, not the short one. The long C
No,
word.
no, 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 no.
Um,
We well, I've always, you know, that being the reasonable man rather than the hothead that you are, I always believed that the time in coalition between the
you
Conservatives
use
and
the
the
C
Liberal
word now.
Democrats
That's
was a time of great beauty, and was politically a fabulous time in our political history. Unfortunately, the voters, many of whom now cry for proportional representation, as we both know, gathered with pitchforks and torches, and did terrible things to the Lib Dems as a result of their very reasonable participation. But we are getting off topic, so
just a
I
tad.
guess the
Let's kind
key
of
thing there.
try and wheel that back in.
Yeah, yeah. So Rachel Reeves, George Osborne, separated at birth, Simon?
I can't say that I've kind of ever looked at it like that. I mean, neither if you neither are terribly exciting people to kind of watch as they speak. But to be fair, that's not really. If you want entertainment, then I think the skills and the personality you need to be an entertaining speaker are, I think, mutually exclusive with those of a decent Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I don't mind a bit of, if I'm honest, I'd quite happily settle for a bit of boring. What I just find interesting is that it's depending on which side someone comes from, or which, whether someone's a Conservative backbencher or a Conservative shadow minister, or whether they're a Labour backbencher or a Labour minister, they'll have very, very different opinions as to what the root causes of the financial strife that the country finds itself in, and very, very short memories about how we kind of got to this point and what there is that it actually is in control. One of the things that, interestingly, one of our viewers has said that kind of makes almost actually the entire conversation almost irrelevant after all of that excitement and that build up was that they were pointing out that obviously what happens in the States could completely blow all of this out of the water, and all of those plans for that minuscule amount of growth over the next 4 years could utterly be decimated by someone waking up on Monday morning and deciding to put a load of tariffs on stuff.
Yeah, and I think whilst I think that's valid, and it is valid, because we've got a president the other side of the pond who fires out something controversial every day of the week, and sometimes two or three things in a single day. I guess the problem you've got with we've talked already about the OBR have to make projections, and all projections are made on assumptions. And again, because we're going to play, because this is a fiscally heavy, we're going to play management bullshit bingo. And what does assume do, Simon?
It makes an ass out of you and me. I would just love to look at a financial statement or a financial event where the projections actually came in remotely close to actually what happened.
Well, and again, I'm going to throw another one in here because it's just where my idiom is today. There are only ever two types of forecast: lucky and wrong. And so
Yeah.
we've got to roll with that. And I think that if we look at it, then yes, there's an element of if President Trump decides to put 25% tariffs on European car imports, Jaguar Land Rover are looking around their boardroom table probably at the end of last week thinking, oh, that's a problem. So yes, I think in all of these things, there could be external influences that throw that out.
I mean,
so do you want to?
Yeah. So go on. No, go on.
Did you want to pick another one for us to have a little delve into?
Well, I think another one that was quite interesting, because what's obviously keen about the other big element internationally is actually the talk about defence spending. And I think some key things that have been that were talked about there was that next year the spending on defence was due to rise by 2.9 billion, but now that's been increased by a further 2.2 billion, being quoted as a down payment on getting to the 2.5% of national income by 2027. So I'm always struck whenever anyone says something as a percentage of either GDP or GNI, so either gross domestic product or gross national income, that there are obviously there's two different ways to affect that percentage, isn't there? There's the ability to spend more on that thing. Or if you're trying to reduce that thing, you either spend less on it or you grow the GDP if you're using, as a percentage of GDP. Or likewise, if actually your national income is actually reducing, then you could find that actually your military spend goes up as a percentage of your national income because actually your income is going down.
Well, and therein lies the interesting dilemma, doesn't it? Because if you look at the figures across the pond, there is a fear that for America, that it's going to go into recession.
Mm.
So as a percentage of the GDP, their defense spending will increase if they keep it all the same. But I think on this one, there's a couple of things in play. One is that I think there's some signposting and signalling across the pond. I think there is this element of, and I hear words like appeasement, which makes me pinch the bridge of my nose and shake my head slowly.
Mm.
But there appears to be a recognition that it's something that all European nations probably should have done sooner. So
Yeah.
I think there's a little flash of ankle there towards Donald Trump and the US side of things to say, look, not only are we going to do it in 27, but we're starting sooner. I guess the flip side to that is that international aid will be paying most of that bill.
Yeah, and that was a key. So I think there were some key bits to unpack about spending on defence. Yes, absolutely the right thing to be, certainly in the current climate, to be spending more money on defence, but that to be coming at the cost of foreign aid that is a soft power that essentially can. Or it can be a cheaper way in actually preventing further more expensive things happening in the future. Then yeah, that it seems like a strange way to. I mean, as it writes itself, doesn't it? Is you go to war with welfare to basically go to war. You're paying for paying for bombs with other things, but at the same time, yes. We need to spend more on our national defence. We've lived through a period of time where we've become too comfortable after the Cold War winding down of lots of expenditure on defence, and sadly that time unfortunately has passed because not all of the countries out there are friendly, and the best way to stop aggressive countries from doing aggressive things is to show that you can stop them. But it's yeah. So I thought that was good in the sense of not where the money's coming from, but that commitment, and also then with the aim of actually reaching 3% in the next Parliament. Although that was something the Conservatives said that the government should be bringing forward to this Parliament, but not saying actually where the money would come from if that was what they were going to do.
Well,
thing for
and I
us
think,
is
Simon, there is.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's worth just pausing there, isn't it? Because there was an element of, I believe in the Conservative manifesto, they committed to 2.5%, and their original commitment was to look towards, could we possibly get to 3 in the next Parliament?
Yeah.
And it is the Yahoo sucks politics to say, well, 3%, you should be doing it in this Parliament, and it is that element of, yes, of course we should,
Yeah, but
but
how?
but well, and that is that's the fundamental of all politics, isn't it? Even on the things we agree on, we often can't agree where they should be funded from. So, everyone seems to sort of nod and say, well, the 2.5% of GDP on defence is the right thing to do,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't disagree with you that the aid budget looks a soft target to get the money from. And I think if as we might come on to some of the other cuts, I guess if it wasn't going to come from foreign aid, it's got to come from somewhere else. And it feels like all the somewhere else levers are already being pulled, and some of them are pretty unpalatable, um, either across the political spectrum or especially to those kind of Labour voters slash supporters slash members of Parliament who kind of perhaps aren't wildly keen on the direction that the party's taking when leading the way.
No, I think unfortunately that seems to be quite the narrative at the moment. I think disappointment is probably the underselling it. That Labour are experiencing from their own supporters and from their own backbenchers, but there aren't any easy choices, which is again, kind of why it just seems a bit, to me, it just seems politically opportunist and not helpful for everyone else to just be saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I think that they've made all of the right choices, but I do think it's very easy as an opposition, for any opposition party, to say, oh, well, we wouldn't have done that. Great. What would you have done instead?
Well, and it is the fundamental of government, isn't it? And
Yeah.
Labour's been in opposition for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of their, shall we say, more traditional Labour, perhaps those more to the left of the party, I think are still in opposition emotionally. Just their opposition now is with their own party. And I guess when you look at things like fiscal rules and, you know, uh, the traditional Labour values have been about wealth redistribution, which is tax and spend and borrow. And,
Yeah.
those options, when you've got taxation at the highest level it's ever been, you've got a record national debt, which in the Yabu sucks politics was something Rachel referred to in her speech, and left us with record national debt. Hang about, wasn't most of that, or an awful lot of that, was, you know, bailing out people's fuel bills, paying for furlough, all things you fundamentally supported. Well, shut up, move on. So I do think there is a piece of, you know, we are in tough economic times.
Yeah, we're in really crap times. But I guess we have actually been in situations where the national debt has actually been greater than its current percentage of GDP.
Yeah.
After the Second World War, and look at the things that we did then. We had even less money then, and we still managed to do great, big, amazing, wonderful things that changed the country for the better. Were the right things. Build all that housing, start the NHS, expand the welfare state. All of those things.
All of those great things.
Yes.
Whilst at the same time, people were still having food rationed for 7-8 years.
Yeah, but that.
So
yes,
if we talk about, if we go back, it is easy to, and I think there is that element of, and I guess we if you've just been through 6 years of World War, and everyone knows somebody who's gone to war and never come back, then the government selling a message of tough times, we're all in it together, we've got to pull hard to get the housing that was bombed rebuilt, and all of those things. I guess people are more ready to hear it than when you've lived through a period of relative prosperity. And I don't know that when you compare rationing, and we'll move on to relative poverty in a minute, those are not the same thing. So
no, they're not. I just, and it's very easy to look on the past with a lens of nostalgic hindsight, or to look at, and certainly things, absolutely, I can't even begin to imagine it. They certainly weren't easy. But at the same time, I'm just trying to make the point that we have a lot of these rules, and if anything, when I listened to the Chancellor's speech, I thought that actually what she was going to actually she said repeatedly in the opening paragraphs about how things have changed, and how it's a different kind of world, and there are lots of things that are no longer kind of reliable. I thought that was going to be the point, that she was going to be pivoting to say the right thing to do is to set aside one of my fiscal rules at this point, and therefore invest directly in XYZ that is going to improve productivity in the country, or is going to increase job prospects within the country. I thought that was where she was going to pivot to, but she didn't.
I don't. Oh well, and
the Tories would have eaten her for breakfast for doing it, but that's where I thought she was going to go. But no,
I think that would have been her Liz Truss moment.
I think that would have been scaring the horses.
Yeah. Honestly, I think had she have done that, because you've got to remember that when she stood up in October, her whole shtick was about, I'm going to bring stability. I'm going to bring stability. This, and I'll go into my Starmer coalition of chaos. The whole Labour piece was about stability, was about, we're not old Labour. And for me, if after 6 months her opening statement would have been, fiscal rules, no, it's a bit difficult, so I'm going to bin them off, and we are going to go back to being Labour's borrow, tax and spend. I think and because I think that's how the markets would have received it. I think that's how Parliament would have received it. And I think all but those on the further left of politics would have had a meltdown. And I think had she have just gone all 6 months in, bit tricky, bin the rules, borrow more, I think she would have been eaten for breakfast, Simon.
Okay, well, there we go.
Yeah,
This is why I'm not a political consultant.
yeah.
So, and then
Yeah.
instead,
Should we flick to the welfare stuff and just run through that again? Because I think that's probably from a political perspective, I think that's the one that is causing the most alarm, isn't it?
So I've got some highlights about the welfare stuff. So the health element of universal credit for new claimants. So that was an interesting thing about what a difference that would make, because you're not doing anything to change existing claimants, right? Will be frozen after it being reduced from £97 to £50, and will also exclude anyone from under the age of 22 from being eligible for the health element. There's going to be £1 billion worth of employment support to help people back into work. No, it seemed to be how that was expressed would be support for them. But I wondered what they're doing to help support employers to actually help make the arrangements and the accommodations that they need to do in order to help people back into the workplace in order to make that work, because that might be something that employers are struggling
that
with.
thought.
Okay,
and I will come back.
We'll put a pin in that one.
Yeah, definitely.
400 million support for job centres. The universal credit standard allowance is rising from £14 a week, by £14 a week by 2030. It was last week. It was announced that it was going to be £15, so they shaved the quid off there. Stricter eligibility test for personal independence payment from November 2026, including additional eligibility requirements for disability living allowance. And the other one was the OBR stating about the 4.8 billion. And that increasing relative poverty to a total of 14.5 million by 2930, of which 50,000 of those would be children. So there's quite a lot there, but again, it's so on one side you've got the Conservatives making the argument that, and I think actually in their manifesto they said they were going to make about, wasn't it actually more than double this sort of saving that they were going to make on the welfare bill?
Yes, indeed. And the Conservatives had been bringing down the welfare bill up until the pandemic. And the challenge that the government faces is that
your screen is frozen, by the way.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, I've got your audio, but you are just a frozen, thoughtful, pensive face at the minute.
I don't know whether that's my
Have I lost you? Okay, so just while I wait for Ian to just sort that out quickly, I'm just going to go through a couple of the comments. So we've got Northern Brace basically saying that that's all basically nonsense, that it's the investment in job workshops and ghost job adverts. I'm not quite sure what ghost job adverts are, but let me just see if I can get Ian back in. Am I back? You are back, and you are moving.
Marvellous.
Yes, welcome back.
So thank you for that. No, that was a brief internet glitch. Yeah, so the challenge that the government faces is that personal independence payments are paid both to people in work and who are not in work, who have disabilities. And they are increasing there are new applicants at roughly 1,000 per day. And of those new applicants, the vast majority are in the under 40s category, and the majority of those applicants are around anxiety, social phobia, ADHD, autism, spectrum disorders. That is where that huge increase is coming from. And for anybody listening to this who hasn't listened before, I am blind, and for full disclosure, I am in receipt of personal independence payment. So I don't want to create a kind of league table of disability. But the challenge that the government faces is that this bill is growing exponentially. And I think what a number of people don't realize is that PIP isn't about the medical model of disability. So, I can go to an eye doctor who can certify that I am blind. That doesn't get me PIP. PIP is about how your disability affects you.
Mm.
So if somebody has a mental health challenge, if they complete the PIP form and and kind of explain they cannot undertake everyday tasks, they can't go out, they can't function, and I'm going to put normally in air quotes, in society, then they will be entitled to PIP. And I think this is where the government is in a really tough spot in terms of deciding how to control this explosion in people who are, and if I use the word self-identifying, I know it sounds judgmental, but who are self-identifying as disabled by the condition they have. The current system means that the government has no option but to pay them.
Well, I think that's probably a whole podcast on itself, isn't it? As a whole episode on itself about at what point do you, I guess, from a government level, you want to kind of draw a fairly easy to understand and consistent line of who would and who wouldn't. But I guess in reality, each case is different, and there may be a variety of different needs and maybe a variety of different help that some people need. But I think does it come down to, at the end of the day, if the aim is to try to find a way to help, because there's something that the vast majority of people, there is something that they can do to work. But the $64 million question is what and how you help them being able to do that, bearing in mind whatever physical or otherwise struggles that they may have, or whatever disabilities that they may have. At the end of the day, it's on one end you've got it's absolutely wrong to write those people off and leave them in a dependency lifestyle. Lifestyle is probably the wrong word, so my apologies. But on the other hand, it's literally unreasonable and unfair to expect the same things of them as others without them having the required amount of assistance or type of assistance that they need in order to help them enter the workplace, or indeed to help their potential employers understand what their requirements are and accommodate them.
And that reasonable adjustment piece, which is what you touched on at the end there. So I've spent the last probably 6 or 7 years coaching and mentoring people with vision impairment to help them either progress their career or get back into work. And for me, my first-hand experience, and this doesn't apply to all disabilities, but in the sector that I work in, there are 2 things. The first is confidence, and believing that the person has something that is transferable skills that would be useful to an employer. But the biggest issue and the barrier is the employers themselves, who, again, just speaking to sight loss, many wouldn't actively discriminate, but have very closed minds as to how somebody with a vision impairment would do that job. So I think if we just, I think there's a whole other podcast in this. I think the challenge which I think the Chancellor is going to have, is, you know, 250,000 new families or new people moving into relative poverty and 50,000 children moving into relative poverty is not something that would sit well with. It does. I don't think it sits well with anybody, and would definitely not sit well with Labour values. I think the only thing that the OBR did say is that that projection does not take into account potentially the impact of lifting people of the employment, lifting the number of
So
kind of
if
disabled
some of those
people.
people get jobs and therefore
Yeah,
they're lifted
they,
into
they
work and
exactly, they will come out of that. But I think it is it's a really big issue. That I think I think there's still bumps in the road on this one, because I think a lot of that is still in a green paper which needs discussion,
mhm.
and yeah, I think there will be significant backlash.
There was an interesting note in the executive summary of the OBR's report, which spoke to the government. The memorandum of understanding between the OBR and governments is that they basically provide notice of that they're going to require a statement from the OBR with at least 10 weeks notice. The government gave them an extra 4 weeks worth of notice, but further on in the summary, it speaks to there were a couple of change last minute. Sorry, not last minute. There were a couple of later on changes, and they said there were minor changes to the policies about welfare that they didn't actually have a chance to fully explore what the impact of those would be. They also called out some other stuff that were to do with supply side reactions to policies in other parts of the economy. So it's just interesting that if that's if that's actually a key kind of thing, that's the very thing that hasn't kind of been studied in detail by the OBR.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would, because obviously you would expect when the Green Paper was read a week ago last Tuesday that the impact assessment would be issued at the same time. But the impact assessment where these numbers of 250,000 come from was not issued until the day of the spring statement. So it suggested there was a bit of a lag there. So I guess time is moving on.
Mm-hmm.
And I was chanting along at the end, promised by Labour, delivered by Labour, opposed by the parties opposite, because that would seem to be a bit of a new chanting mantra for Rachel. So did
I feel like I've let you down by not counting the number of times that she said and opposed by the parties opposite.
So I take it the parties opposite opposed what she had to say?
Well, so the parties opposite. So, I mean, first went Mel Stride, who's the shadow chancellor. So he's basically a Conservative equivalent, and it took a while to kind of get into actually what the points that he was trying to make, and there was lots of flamboyant and jingoistic stuff at the start of his speech, but essentially his speech came down to we left it perfectly fine. All of the things that happened and went wrong during our time in government weren't our fault. It's wrong that you're claiming that the things that are going wrong now that you're in government that aren't your fault. We left you with a good ship. You've and he used some language that the speaker wasn't very happy with, which was when he mentioned about fiddling the targets, because that's essentially accusing them
fiddling the figures,
of lying, which is not parliamentary language. So it was essentially of, it would have been so much better if we were in charge. Oh, and Rachel can claim that it's great that interest rates have gone down 3 times since they came to power, but we all know that they would have gone down by more if we'd still been in power.
Well, the fascinating thing there, wasn't it, was the whole thing around inflation.
Yes.
So on the day that keys changed hands, it was
Yes.
bang on the 2% target.
Yes.
And now it's 3.2%. What are you doing, you clowns? Well, there's also the element of, and Rachel in the same style, well, inflation was 11% when you had your hand on the tiller. And there was a little bit of backwards and forwards, and nobody stops to say, well, hang about, it's the role of the Bank of England to try and control
Yeah, that
inflation. So are
yeah.
you claiming victory for them or you? Because if it's you, then
Yeah, you can't have both. You can't on one hand say that when it was 11% it wasn't anything to do with you, but then when it was 2% it was something to do with you.
yep.
You can't have it
And
both ways, can you?
yeah, so I thought Mel Stride's response was, well, I thought both, there was
Yeah.
as I say, the promise by Labour, delivered by Labour,
Yeah, they both did
and
it. They both did a lot of that. They both ended their speeches with actually, it was in Rachel's response to Mel Stride's speech, but Mel's basically, you promised X, you didn't. You promised this, you said you wouldn't do this, you did. You said you wouldn't do this, you did, and he came across with a list of all of those things and those responses. It's just that kind of chanting
yeah,
footballish
so
kind of atmosphere that seems to be quite so prevalent in Parliament these days. But yeah, and then Rachel did a similar thing but we've lowered inflation, we've lowered the NHS waiting lists,
NHS waiting list 5 months in a row.
yeah. So it was just very kind of interesting, and then there were lots of other speeches, but the kind of party size wise, the Daisy Cooper was the spokesperson for the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
And
what did Daisy have to say for
so
herself?
essentially, to paraphrase Daisy Cooper, what she called out was well, hang on, people voted for change. Where is the change? This isn't the change people voted for. And could you possibly stop punishing disabled people or elderly people or those in needs and actually go after the mega multinationals a bit more? Essentially was the summary of that speech, which is the Conservatives left it in a complete utter mess, and people voted for change, but where is it?
Yeah. So Daisy turned the rhetoric up to max, and
Yes.
I'm guessing Nigel stood up and said, "Well, it's all the fault of the immigrants."
Yes. Nigel Farage surprised no one from Reform, just in case there was like one person in the room that doesn't know which group Nigel's running these days. And he made the point that, which is, to be fair, which is a sound point in the sense of people don't experience an increase in GDP, but they do experience an increase in GDP per capita because of actually essentially how that kind of wealth distribution, to use that phrase. I know wealth distribution sounds terribly woke. I should probably. I'm sure he wouldn't approve.
You're an old lefty at heart. We're always going to
Well, yeah.
go with it.
But he did blame that basically on we've essentially, and again I'm paraphrasing him a bit, but we've essentially he's claimed that that's never going to improve because we've had open door immigration essentially, and there's loads of immigrants coming into the country, and that's why people feel poorer. Which is obviously a dependable point to come from Farage's side of the political spectrum.
So, in summary, then, Labour said it was all the nonsense they inherited and the world has changed, so it wasn't nothing to do with them. The Conservatives came back with it was nothing to do with us. It was all fixed by the time we gave it to you. What have you done to it?
Yeah.
Daisy's position was you're both rubbish. You've not changing anything. Tax the corporations, tax the rich.
Yes.
And Nigel shouted, well, it's all the fault of the bloody immigrants.
Pretty much. There we go. We could have saved ourselves like 55 minutes.
Yeah, and I guess it's that important thing, isn't it, Simon, to just try and strip away the pantomime. And I think that's possibly why, folk who aren't as dedicated as you and I, who are prepared to sift through all those puddles of mud to try and find the real nuggets of gold.
I don't. Well, they might be nuggets, but I don't know that they're gold.
Well, we'd like to think of ourselves as truth brokers at the very least. So I guess if you and I take a step back in terms of our own views on the budget, should we start with should we be positive? How do you want to do this? Do we go positive or negative first?
See, I kind of find it really hard because this was a something and nothing thing. And you mentioned it earlier on. this was a spring statement, not a budget. The Conservatives tried to make a big thing out of it being an emergency budget, considering there were no actually real there's no kind of massive headline changes. And if it was an emergency budget, there were no big levers being pulled or pushed in any particular way. So in some ways, I think I kind of see it as kind of something and nothing. The thing about the reductions in welfare spend, to me, I find that more stick than carrot, and wonder that actually, there's the bit of me that thinks if you looked at the root cause of why people aren't working and tried to get some sort of statistical distribution about why people don't feel that they're able to work and work that problem, instead of just saying, wow, I'm just going to pull this from under you and therefore you will that just kind of seems that seems the wrong way to me. That wouldn't seem the logical way. Yes, because some people will do that because they will force themselves to go into it. But if you're not fixing the underlying problem, if a vast majority of the people under 22 are suffering with anxiety, or there's problems because of them trying to understand their place in the world, if they're not getting the help that they need with ADHD or with other things like that, considering the massive backlogs in actually getting medical diagnosis and getting help with all of those things, if you fix those things, then maybe actually those people would have better outcomes in education, and therefore would end up actually having better outcomes when they come to entering into the job market.
Well, it's almost a whole other show, isn't it?
It is.
I think we've
like
touched on it.
Three different shows that we could make out of this.
Yeah, well, it's touched on it before. The number of children who are identifying as SEND, having special educational needs or disabled, has doubled since 2019, and it's now nearly 1 in 5. So I guess if you were a responsible government looking ahead and you said, "Oh my Lord, is 1 in 5 of those children going to come out of the system?" And again, the language is awful, but identifying as disabled, and there is that element where if you are 16, 17, then if you're on what was employment support allowance and PIP, then you are you have £1,500 a month, best part of, in your pocket.
Yeah, but
and
nobody really wants to live that way, do they? No one wants to.
Well, I guess nobody wants to live that way. But if you're 17, 18, 19, and you're living at home and you've got a 4-figure sum in your bank account every month, you can live a pretty decent 18-year-old life on that when you compare it alongside your mate who's having to work 40 hours a week, and isn't taking home much more than that. So the danger then is that it's a pathway that people then can't get off of. So I think in terms of, like we say, we won't do the whole other show now in the interest of time. I think the thing for me, which I didn't like, Simon, is actually, it's a little bit subtle, but I think it's important, is lots of cuts to the civil service were announced, and senior managers tend not to cut themselves or the managers. So a lot of entry level positions going. Unemployment is rising, and the national insurance rises, and the welcomed living wage rises in April. I don't think it's going to help that. So we see 2 indicators that are going to lead to less employment, but the solution to the welfare problem is to get people into work. And I think for me, without wishing to delve into that, those 3 things didn't join up as a straight line for me, because I fear it's going to be harder
because there won't be as many jobs around.
Exactly that, and particularly those that are sort of entry level jobs, because as I say, senior managers tend not to make themselves redundant. They tend to look at the lower levels. There must have been something in there you liked, Simon.
I mean, I don't know if "like" is the right word. I think it was the right thing to do to increase spending on defence. I think that's absolutely needed. And it was absolutely right to be looking to find ways of being more innovative and with that expenditure. and to have as much of that actually being for homegrown industry, so that investment actually goes back into our own economy, into rather than into someone else's, and that also kind of helps against the picture that we have with some of the unpredictable responses from across the Atlantic. Is that okay? Then fine. We've got actually some quite large and very, very competent and very expert defence industries of our own. Let's start investing in them and the people that work for them. Those are high paid, high skilled jobs. That would be good. Let's do more of that. I think that's a good thing. Especially, I mean, Rachel called out a revitalisation of Portsmouth Dockyard, Portsmouth Naval Base.
Dockyard. Yeah. So
I don't quite know what a revitalisation of it would look like, but nonetheless, that's a good thing, because that's, for us being in Portsmouth, that's a good thing around here. So I think those are good. I think where the money is coming from, I don't like, but the same, that's easy for anyone to say, isn't it? I want you to spend on X, but I don't like. I don't know. I haven't got an answer of where the magic money tree is.
Yeah, finding it is your problem, not ours. No, and again, in terms of future shows, if there is anybody listening or anyone who knows what that might mean in terms of Portsmouth Naval Base, we would love to hear from you and explore that as a potential future opportunity. And I guess in closing,
we could just hang around and see whether someone adds us to their WhatsApp group or something. And
well, that is the hope, isn't it? That has always been the hope that that one of us would get added to a Signal group and start to get the inside information. I guess in terms of what I liked, love a fiscal rule, me. And it might be predictable, but there is that element of my biggest fear with Labour was old Labour and tax and spend, and under the kind of quote unquote of investment, large government-led projects seldom end well, and billions are lost repeatedly through history. So the fact that Rachel from accounts stuck to her fiscal rules was my highlight for it. And I think in terms of that stability piece, the response from the stock markets was pretty which was always whenever one of these fiscal events happens, with the more entertaining and knockabout laughsters of Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. As you say, one of the things you don't want your chancellors to be is interesting, in the style of the ancient Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times."
Yeah, you don't want unpredictable chancellors. You want to be able to plot that on a spreadsheet, don't you? You want to be able to understand. Well, we can understand which direction that they're going in, and they've got to try to face more than one direction at once, haven't they? So it's not a job I think I could do for several reasons, but
no, and even with all my years in the Bank of England, which I haven't invented yet, I wouldn't want to do it either. So on that footnote, you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sainsbury. Do join us next time at our more regular time at 6:27 on a Sunday. And I'll put up some socials later on to confirm our next show. But do remember to like, follow, subscribe, etc. wherever you are absorbing our content. And also let us know whether you're team landscape or team portrait. Is it right that we're streaming portrait rather than landscape? We'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.